My grandfather Frank Frazetta was written about and interviewed many times by various people after he became famous, but he never really liked anything anyone ever wrote about him, even the pieces written by his friends, and he always hated being interviewed. Well, at least after seeing what he's said in print. It never does translate the way we think it will, does it? He regularly misremembered details of his history, routinely contradicted himself, and sometimes simply made things up to impress whomever he was talking to, because why not? My grandparents were definitely both enigmas, and their lives can sometimes be a confusing puzzle, one in which all the pieces don't always neatly fit, and some pieces are even missing. I'm Sarah, and welcome back to Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls. A lot of you have been asking curious questions about my grandparents, and tonight I'm going to tackle as many as I can, but we'll definitely need a part 2, so let's get right into it. The first question that I frequently get asked is, did Walt Disney try to hire Frazetta? And the answer is yes. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, my grandpa was drawing funny animal stories and text illustrations for Barnyard Comics, Cuckoo Comics, Goofy Comics, Happy Comics, and Super Mouse. Featuring a wide variety of whimsical animals, Frazetta's art, which he often signed with his nickname Fritz, was charming, and it caught the attention of someone at the Disney studios who sent Frank a letter. I should be clear that it definitely wasn't Walt Disney himself that contacted him, but one of his art directors or talent recruiters. Regardless, whomever it was expressed a deep appreciation for my grandpa's art and asked if he'd be interested in bringing his portfolio to California for an interview. An interview for what exactly? To draw comics or a comic strip or illustrate books or to work as a storyboard or concept artist or maybe even become an animator? I don't know. And I definitely don't think my grandfather ever really did either. Though he was sincerely flattered by the letter, Frazetta never followed up on it, saying, going from Brooklyn to Hollywood in those days was like going to the other side of the world. Maybe I should have done it, but I didn't know anybody in California and I didn't really want to ever leave home. What would have happened to him if he made the journey? We'll never know. For the next question, was Frazetta a fearless street fighter? That's so cute. No, he was not. One of the stories often repeated by fans over the years is that Frank was a fighter who would leap into combat with deadly opponents the size of Conan without hesitation, either in a movie theater or the schoolyard or in the mean streets of Brooklyn, and he would always emerge victorious. People would look at pictures of a shirtless and buff Frazetta in his late 20s posing and horsing around with his friends Al Williamson and Roy Krinkle and believe that they showed the unconquerable bruiser that was sending gangs of bullies crying to the hospital. Frank, of course, was the source of these tales of battles, which he'd share in interviews or with visiting fans, and the stories would spread, change, be inflated, included in his books, and expanded over time. Fans would add to the myths, creating fictional accounts of Frazetta knocking out a bad guy with 1 or 2 punches before they knew what hit him. Frank's tough guy persona became a big part of his legend among awestruck followers, which he tactically encouraged. But was any of it true? Well, when questioned and given time to consider, Frank admitted that his last fights had happened when he was about 12 or 13 years old with other boys his age. The details, winners and losers, lost to time. Grandpa wasn't a big kid, and he often described himself as extra sensitive growing up. He did look fairly small in his vintage photos, and he didn't become an accomplished amateur athlete or reach his adult height of 5'10" until his late teens. By that time, he was also a working professional artist, assisting John Gunta, Graham Ingalls, and Ralph Mayo on their comic stories while also drawing his own. When he wasn't working, he was busy either playing baseball on Brooklyn parade ground fields or various neighborhood teams, or increasingly chasing girls. Frank didn't have the time for fistfights, and he needed his hands to hold a pencil or throw a ball, not put thugs in their place. Growing up, Frank always had a tremendous imagination, as well as a healthy sense for drama, and the tales he told decades later of epic fights with bullies were largely exaggerated youth fantasies. As the years passed, some of those fantasies inadvertently became a part of his official life story. Memories can be fragile, of course, and though some can remain sharp and vivid for decades, others are fleeting and can easily become altered over time. It's true that Frazetta had an enviable visual memory and could often draw something he'd seen once or twice without hunting for a reference, but names, dates, events, and details about his past often were transformed or entirely forgotten, especially as he experienced health problems. So when it comes to the stories of knockdown, drag-out conflicts, there were a few childhood fights that Frazetta's memory memory conflated 50 or 60 years later into stories of magnificent battles between good and evil, Frank being good, naturally, but were actually nothing unusual for any 12-year-old growing up in Brooklyn during the 1930s. And as far as being a street fighter as an adult, Frazetta's close friend Nick Meglin once laughed and said bluntly, "Take a look at that kisser. Frank was too pretty to be a brawler." Next question, was Frazetta a Scientologist? That question has been asked fairly frequently, and the answer is no. Late in his career, my grandpa created covers for several novels by L. Ron Hubbard and for the early writers and illustrators of the future anthologies produced by Bridge Publications, a total of something like 7 or 8 paintings. He also licensed several previously published pieces to them to use as book covers and was one of the jurors for their first illustration competition and appeared at their California gallery several times for special events. But he wasn't curious about the church and he never became a Scientologist. For their part, they respected his feelings and never pressured him to join. When asked about it, my grandpa said it was a job, nothing more. They paid me to do some paintings and that's all there was to it. And just to note, they paid him more than anyone else, and because of that, he sold them both the original artwork and the publishing rights. That income helped my grandparents buy their condo and their downtown building in Boca Grande, Florida, which they'd later turn into their art gallery for about a year. And another frequent question, why didn't Frazetta draw more stories for EC? The easy answer, he was busy, and though he pitched in and inked some of Al Williamson's work and drew the story Squeeze Play when Al decided he didn't want to do it, Grandpa was occupied on the Johnny Comet newspaper strip, creating covers for Famous Funnies and eventually penciling the Sunday page for Little Abner as a member of Al Cap's studio. And when he wasn't working, he was playing amateur baseball with the Islanders, which he much preferred to drawing. Though I'm sure EC would have loved if he had done more work for them, he simply didn't have the time. Next question. Did Frazetta really do his paintings start to finish in a few hours? The answer is sometimes. Frazetta always had a reputation of being fast when he wanted to be, and there were several occasions in which, yes, he started and completed a painting at night after the rest of the family had gone to bed. However, though he was known to push his deadlines, which was the catalyst to most of my grandparents' big fights, it didn't happen all that often, and even on those occasions, he always knew what he was going to paint. Despite his claims in later interviews that he didn't do color roughs or thumbnail sketches and just sat down and started painting, making it all up as he went, that wasn't true. Over a period of days, sometimes weeks before he actually began a painting or drawing, he thought about it, he planned it, and he created roughs, sometimes multiple roughs, for virtually every single cover or book illustration he ever produced. Frazetta said that he couldn't just sit down and bash something out on the spur of the moment, and he had to find inspiration first and prepare before he felt comfortable enough to begin the work on the final art. When he picked up his brush, he'd paint with focus, emotion, and intensity until he was exhausted. Since he'd already figured out what he was going to do with his roughs, which he'd often project with an artograph onto the canvas board and trace, he knew exactly what he was going to do and could work quickly with confidence. A few simpler paintings were finished in 5 or 6 hours, and after a mishap trying to dry the art in the oven, he began using cobalt, manganese, or lead dryers with his oils to accelerate the process. But for the most part, like the Conan or Death Dealer cupboards, he'd often get them into an almost done state in a day or two and then spend another day or longer tightening them up and adding details. Frazetta would say that's the part that's no fun. So yes, some Frazetta paintings were completed in a few hours, but certainly not all of them. So why did Frazetta say every painting he had done was completed in less than a day? Well, I'm only guessing, but maybe it was an expression of hubris to impress people. Or maybe he was just being mischievous because he never liked to tell people too much about his process and would sometimes say things to keep them mystified. Nick Meglin once told a story about taking a friend to meet Frazetta in the late 1980s. Standing in his studio, the visitor asked about a Death Dealer painting. I think it was the cover for Prisoner of the Horned Helmet that was on the easel being worked on. As Grandpa walked out of the studio to get something, he replied casually, "Oh, that's just something I started this morning." The visitor's mouth dropped open and he looked with wonder at Nick, who laughed and said, "Frank's pulling your leg. He was working on that when I was here a few weeks ago," which Frank cheerfully admitted when he returned to the studio. He did have a sense of humor after all. Next question. Who did Frazetta base his version of Conan on, Jack Palance or Charles Bronson? Although people have speculated about this for a very long time, the simple truth is neither. Any resemblance is either a superficial coincidence or fans seeing something that isn't there. My grandfather based all of his heroes on himself, either vaguely or unmistakably, and that included Conan. When asked, Frank would impatiently deny using himself as a model for any of his characters in later years, but he did have a small mirror next to his drawing table that he'd use for facial reference frequently, and to be honest, the art doesn't lie. So, add some scars and long hair to Frazetta's famous self-portrait and you'll see Conan's face staring back at you. Which leads me into another very popular question. Does that mean your grandmother Ellie was the Frazetta girl? Many people want to see my grandma in every woman that my grandpa drew or painted, but it's just not true. Frank began drawing the Frazetta girl long before he ever met Ellie. All artists have their archetypes, and certainly Frank had his. The Frazetta girl all had young faces, often exotic and sometimes vaguely Asian, long legs and voluptuous figures, none of which describes my grandmother. Frank once said, "I have a very personalized woman. You've seen my women, they kind of look alike. I've tried to escape from that, and I was never happy. I'd make a perfectly nice rendering of a female, and it would just make me unhappy. She's got to have a certain look, those eyes that I love." Every so often, he would ask Ellie to pose for a reference photo when he was having a problem, but as she said, "I wouldn't say I posed for Frank a lot, but some. Mostly when he wanted to see what the light would do, sometimes when he wasn't sure about a pose. I'm not busty or curvy like the girls Frank paints, but I've got some sort of cartoon body and can twist and turn into whatever pose he might have needed." For Frank, reference photos were always a starting point, not something to be carefully copied, so any pictures of Grandma he may have used in some way were transformed into a Frazetta girl and not portraits of her. Frazetta did, of course, deliberately paint my grandma over the years, but when enthusiastic fans would describe my grandma as his muse within his earshot and gush that she was the model for every Frazetta girl, my grandpa would explode. "It's all crazy talk. It's nuts. What a joke. I must have had 100 muses. I painted Ellie a few times, so what? I painted the kids too. I painted my mom. Were any of them my muse? Come on." And trust me, when my grandfather was angry, you didn't want to argue with him. Also, for context, when my grandpa did say this about Grandma being his muse, he was probably in a fight with her. So there's that. Okay, right on to the next question. Was Frazetta right or left-handed? He was right-handed until his first stroke in 1996, which resulted in weakness and partial paralysis of his right hand, his arm, and his leg. And despite physical therapy, he was never able to regain full strength and control of his hand. A second major stroke in 2001 added to the damage, and at some point he decided to attempt drawing with his left hand, not with any real agenda in his mind, but more to see if he could do it. And though the results were a bit crude, he was successful. Over the next few years, he produced maybe around a dozen left-handed pencil drawings, at least 2 were commissions, and I think he had 3 oils based on earlier rough sketches and revised several older published paintings. Honestly, none of his left-handed works compare in quality or skill to any of the art he created right-handed when he was healthy, and some of the revised older paintings would have definitely been much better if they'd been left alone. But still, there's a little bit of the old Frazetta magic that's obvious when you look at some of those left-handed pieces, and you gotta give it to him for trying. And for the last question for this segment, a more personal question that I've gotten asked again and again: why did you decide to start Frazetta Girls, and what are some of your future plans? And the answer is, honestly, I started Frazetta Girls because my mom asked me to. The timing was perfect. I had just graduated college and I was working at a post-production studio up in Tampa, Florida, and she guilted me a little bit, and she reminded me how close I was to my grandparents and how much their legacy meant to me. She thought I was the perfect person to do it and kind of appointed me. At the time, there were a lot of legal battles happening with the family, and I was scared to step into the middle of it, but I kept thinking about what she said and how much I love my grandparents, so I decided to do it anyway. And now looking back, I can see that it was my fate all along. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be, and I'm so proud to do this work, and it's truly an honor to carry on this legacy forward. So Our future plans, well, it's just to keep growing. Our motto is we're just getting started, which always reminds us that anything is possible. And in the near future, Frazetta Girls Publishing will offer more titles, Icon Collectibles will offer more figures, and Frazetta Girls will be announcing big collaborations that we've been working on behind the scenes. Well, that's all for this Q&A, but if you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section and I will try my best to answer them in Q&A Part 2 in the new year. And since this will be my final episode for 2025, I want to wish you all a happy holidays and a very Merry Christmas. But before you go, if you learned something or just simply enjoyed this episode of Frazetta Fridays, please like and subscribe and tell another Frazetta fan. Until next time.